Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to completely reframe how we look at the global agricultural supply chain. We really need to shift our mindset away from just simple day-to-day procurement and start focusing heavily on strategic, long-term risk management. Look, if you're sourcing raw agricultural materials, you already know the landscape is shifting right beneath your feet. Relying on those outdated purchasing models, it's honestly a direct threat to your bottom line.
Welcome to the explainer. So, right off the bat, we are going to challenge this traditional view that supply shocks in agriculture are just, unpredictable acts of nature. A bad drought here, a sudden storm there, and yeah, obviously weather plays its part. But we need to look at the hidden systemic vulnerabilities that are lurking just below the surface of your supply chain. We're talking about the deep structural risks that actually drive that long-term price volatility.
I think the SASB Agricultural Product Standard frames this perfectly. Managing sustainability risks within your supply chain is absolutely not some feel-good PR exercise. It is a critical, hard-nosed business strategy imperative. If you really want to secure a reliable supply of raw materials and insulate your company from massive price swings, these sustainability metrics, they're your early warning system. Now, what's really fascinating here is how the International Sustainability Standards Board gives us a concrete, completely measurable matrix to actually track and mitigate these threats. This isn't about vague, hand-wavy environmental goals. This framework breaks things down into quantitative data points. We're talking greenhouse gas emissions, energy management, water stress, and food safety. It literally transforms abstract risks into hard numbers that you can actually manage.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, supply chain price volatility. Second, the climate risk reality. Third, navigating water stress. Fourth, securing food safety. Fifth, supplier audits and compliance. And finally, the long-term strategy.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, Supply Chain Price Volatility and Identifying Your Core Vulnerability.
The absolute crucial starting point is knowing exactly which raw materials are your principal crops. The SASB standards define this super clearly. It's any crop that accounted for 10% or more of your consolidated revenue in any of the last 3 fiscal years. You've got to isolate these specific inputs because, let's face it, any disruption here doesn't just cause a headache in procurement. It directly translates to massive revenue loss for the entire organization.
When you're relying heavily on third-party growers scattered across various countries for those principal crops, you're inherently taking on their operational risks. If you ignore the environmental and social metrics on those specific farms, whether that's poor soil management or unfair labor practices, it's a direct path to compromised crop yields. And as we all know in this industry, compromised yields equal unpredictable, extreme price spikes that can literally wipe out your profit margins overnight.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Climate Risk Reality and Assessing Environmental Threats.
Now, if your principal crops are exposed to these specific climate scenarios, you are staring down the barrel of inevitable supply shortages, unless you're actively mapping and mitigating these vulnerabilities. We're talking about fundamental shifts in viable crop regions. Imagine a crop that thrived in a certain region for decades, and suddenly it just can't. We're also seeing the migration of agricultural pests into entirely new territories, way more frequent extreme weather events, and perhaps the most critical one of all, severe scarcity of water.
Which brings us to Section 3, Navigating Water Stress, your ultimate liquid asset.
Greater than 80%. I really want that number to stick in your head. This is the threshold for what the World Resources Institute's aqueduct tool classifies as extremely high baseline water stress. The SASB standards actually require entities to analyze what percentage of their total water withdrawn and consumed happens right inside these specific danger zones. So ask yourself right now, do you actually know what percentage of your principal crops are sourced from regions hitting this 80% stress mark? To secure your supply in those highly stressed regions, the SASB standards highlight some very specific operational and engineering investments. It's really about dramatically reducing your reliance on stressed water sources. You can do this by implementing water recycling and closed-loop systems, or maybe even fundamentally redesigning your products so they just require less water to process in the first place. It also means using tools like the WRI aqueduct to map out your risks before you ever build a new facility. And crucially, fostering genuine collaborations with local communities so you aren't just fighting them for a dwindling resource.
All right, let's pivot to Section 4, Securing Food Safety and Protecting the Brand.
Look, food safety is paramount. We all know that. The standards requires tracking the total metric tons of food product recalled, but pay close attention to this distinction here. Was it an involuntary recall? A complete regulatory nightmare mandated by authorities because you were out of compliance or imported defective goods? Or was it a voluntary recall, something initiated proactively by your own internal quality control before things got out of hand? Tracking not just the raw volume, but the actual nature of these recalls is a fantastic metric for evaluating the true operational health of your processing facilities.
Now for Section 5, Supplier Audits and Compliance, and how we manage the chain.
You absolutely must have total, crystal clear visibility into your Tier 1 suppliers. Remember, these are the suppliers that transact directly with your entity, because at the end of the day, their environmental and social practices are entirely your reputational risk. Whether it's how they handle child labor, how they manage pesticide exposure for their field workers, or their adherence to the Global Food Safety Initiative. If a Tier 1 supplier fails a major audit, it is your brand's reputation on the line.
And when we talk about measuring supply chain health, it's not just about tracking the rate of major versus minor nonconformances during those supplier audits. A minor issue might just be an isolated one-off incident. A major one is a systemic failure requiring auditor escalation. But what really truly matters is Step 3, the corrective action rate. Are these suppliers successfully executing a plan to eliminate the root cause within that critical 90-day window? If your corrective action rate is low, your supply chain is incredibly fragile. Period.
Finally, Section 6, the long-term strategy and sourcing for stability.
For those principal crops we talked about earlier, you need to deeply understand the vast difference in risk profile between your sourcing methods. With contract growing, you have a direct agreement with the farmer. You can dictate the crop production conditions, you can enforce your environmental standards, and ensure quality. Contrast that with commodity sourcing, where you're just buying through spot markets or grain elevators. Here, your production control is entirely lost. If you're sourcing your most critical crops purely as commodities, you are essentially flying blind when it comes to sustainability risks.
So how do we fix this? How do we build that stability? By actively utilizing these specific tools. First, obviously, you need to diversify your global suppliers so a localized drought doesn't just halt your entire production. You can implement supplier training programs and agricultural management practice systems, teaching better fertilizer use, better pest management. You should be aggressively pursuing third-party certified products, leaning heavily on rigorous standards like the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil or Fair Trade. By layering these operational tactics with smart financial hedging and crop insurance, you transform those abstract sustainability risks into a fortified, completely reliable, and predictable supply chain. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one fundamental question. Are your principal crops strategically secure for the next decade? Based on everything we've unpacked today from the SASB frameworks, take a hard look and evaluate if your procurement strategy is truly prepared for the physical, regulatory, and operational realities of the modern agricultural market. Because hoping for good weather and stable spot market prices, that's just no longer a viable business strategy. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive. Until next time, keep looking beneath the surface.